Good morning, and welcome to Morning Movie News, where Warner Brothers Animation continues to impress with their ability to stand out from the crowd. And animation is indeed a very crowded field right now. But every studio, interestingly, is kind of developing their own persona. Pixar, of course, makes you cry. And Illumination Entertainment is refreshingly European. But it seems that Warner Brothers is going for smart and edgy, which they did beautifully with the Lego Movie, although, of course, they were infamously snubbed by the Oscars with that film. But I think that it did so well at the box office and did allow them to stand out from the crowd that they're going to continue with that persona, or to develop that persona anyway. And while they're doing a slew of Lego movies, it looks like they're also going to branch out in some other directions, most notably with some Looney Tunes films. And the first character, actually, to get the nod, they are discussing doing a Space Jam 2. But this was very interesting. A Speedy Gonzales movie was announced yesterday. And at first glance, that seems like a very antiquated idea, right? Like today's modern Latino culture doesn't seem reflected by Speedy Gonzales, right? At least to someone coming from, I guess you could say, the Anglo-American mindset. However, Eugenio Derbez is going to be voicing Speedy Gonzales, and he did a wonderful job, setting up this film and getting people excited about it. I mean, the guy is a master businessman, and because he's not only Mexico's most famous comedian, at least these days, but he's also a very strong businessman. He produces, he directs, and his Instructions Not Included film, which I saw when it came here to the States, it's a Spanish language film, but it came here with subtitles, and it was not only a fantastic movie, but it was very successful, and is, I believe, still, and it was, when it was released, the highest grossing Spanish language film here in the United States of all time. So Eugenio Derbez is a great choice for this. But how did he frame it? Well, he said, Speedy Gonzales is a hero to the Latino culture, and a Robin Hood figure. And I grew up loving this character, and I'm so excited to bring him to the silver screen. And I feel particularly nice about it because my actual full name, not my Hollywood name, is Eugenio Derbez Gonzales. And that was fantastic. It was like, wow, that's so smart. So the other thing, and this was also very smart, and that I'm sure Warner Brothers publicity helped shape this article as well. But they said, Eugenio Derbez has a wonderful track record when it comes to voicing animated characters. For instance, in the Shrek movies, he took over for Eddie Murphy as the voice of Donkey, again for Spanish language dubs. And they said, he was so clever, he added lots of local flair and inside jokes to his performance that it made Shrek perform particularly well in Spanish language countries. So that seems to make it seem that Speedy Gonzales is going to be something that hits in multiple areas. And they also said on that note that they're planning on doing Speedy Gonzales in both English and Spanish. And that is where, of course you can dub any movie over, but this is where the characters' mouths will be animated or reanimated to look like they're speaking both languages in each cut. And now this is something they did very successfully with Kung Fu Panda 3, where of course, as we discussed, it was largely animated at Oriental DreamWorks out in China, and they had a Mandarin cut, which also had the characters' mouths moved to that dialogue track. So that's very, very smart, and will only make Speedy Gonzales a more potent performer. I would actually want to maybe see it in Spanish because, of course, that seems like what it should be seen in, right? I think the Americans have to get over this subtitle version because, we'll see. I guess because we're the biggest, until China overtakes us, which could happen probably next year, we are still the biggest market, and I guess we can do whatever we want. But I'm glad that some other countries are starting to do English language films so they can at least get a foot in the door. But they're describing Speedy Gonzales, again, as a Robin Hood figure, and they actually reference Donald Trump, saying that this is an important character to bring about now in the age of Donald Trump, and of course the very disparaging things he said about people coming to this country from Mexico. They said it's important to have this hero come on the scene, and to be voiced by Eugenio Derbez. So I think this sounds, it's really funny. The headline made it seem like maybe not such a great idea, but when you read the whole article and what they have planned and who's involved, it sounds like a stellar idea. And I'd be very curious to see how this ends up performing at the box office, because we all know that the Latino market has become incredibly potent at the box office. So we'll see. I'm curious, how does this movie sound to you? And have Eugenio Derbez and Warner Brothers won you over as they have me? So that's the first story of the day. Now, the second story of the day is about Dave Bautista, who, of course, some of you might recall, I was not a fan of in Guardians of the Galaxy. I felt that he just really did not have the acting chops. I felt, he wasn't a Dwayne Johnson. He was more along the lines of when other wrestlers try and become actors. Acting is harder than one might think. But I have to say, I'm very impressed with Dave Bautista's ability to stick around despite that. And a lot of people really liked his performance in Guardians of the Galaxy. In particular, they felt maybe that to some reason it really spoke to a number of people. And Dave Bautista has been able to take that support and really parlay it into some spectacular opportunities for himself. Now, for instance, he got a role in Spectre, and there was a lot of discussion about how he insisted that he be an intellectual character, that his character not be, just muscle, right? But of course, as we all know, having seen the movie, that's kind of what he turned out to be. But he still was in Spectre, so you got to give it to Dave Bautista for that, and I think that he's done a very good job of making sure that he gets into prestige films. So now he's got that going for him, and he's been able to take that, Guardians of the Galaxy and the sequel that they're currently filming, and his work in Spectre, and land himself a role in Blade Runner 2, adding a very interesting dimension to the cast that now features, of course, Harrison Ford, Ryan Gosling, and Robin Wright. Now, with just the three of them, that seems like a little bit of an intellectual sci-fi film, right? And we still don't know how potent Harrison Ford is at the box office these days when he doesn't have a more popular brand behind him, like Indiana Jones or Star Wars. So I think when you add Dave Bautista, it's a little bit of an olive branch to the modern, fanboy audience, right? Like, it has a Marvel connection, and it makes the film just seem a tad more commercial. Also, Denis Villeneuve is directing, and while he's a spectacularly talented director, his movies have also not done particularly well at the box office. So I think it's very savvy. I think everyone's been savvy here. I think Dave Bautista is very savvy in how he continues to build his career despite not being a particularly good actor. And I think that the Blade Runner team is being very savvy in the movie that they are assembling. And I think Dave Bautista is a vital ingredient to this movie being financially successful. So it's just interesting. Ronda Rousey has tried to build an acting career as well. Maybe her mistake is that she talks too much, and she might want to consider following in Dave Bautista's footsteps. So, and also, he tweeted out a tease about this a few days ago with a picture of himself in a glass unicorn, which is a callback, of course, to the original movie. And I wondered if Dave Bautista came up with that or someone on his publicity team did. Because if Dave Bautista came up with it, that's pretty darn clever, and I would have a lot of respect for him for knowing the mythology of that kind of, somewhat obscure franchise. But like we all know that Benedict Cumberbatch is really into this kind of fandom stuff. So I think if Dave Bautista genuinely is, he should work a little bit harder to make sure that we know that, because it's impressive. I think he doesn't want to seem like a puppet. Even if sometimes he plays a puppet in these movies, he shouldn't seem like one in his everyday life. But I'm curious, how does this sound to you? Are you excited about Blade Runner 2? And if you were maybe only medium about it, does Dave Bautista make you any more excited? All right, so that's the second story of the day. Now, the third story of the day is Netflix, which has gotten itself yet another movie. This one's coming together. The big headline yesterday was that Domhnall Gleeson has signed on. Domhnall Gleeson, of course, being the son of Brendan Gleeson, who had a very good jumpstart to his career with About Time, wonderful Richard Curtis romantic comedy with Rachel McAdams, very good film if you haven't seen it. But I think he's lost his way a little bit, and he's kind of gotten stuck in these weird supporting roles, which is unfortunate because I do believe he's a leading man. So let's talk about the path of his career, and then we'll jump over to what he's doing with Netflix. So, of course, About Time was a big step for him. But then, and he was in Ex Machina, but I think that really has obviously become Alicia Vikander's movie, right? And to some degree, Oscar Isaac's movie. No one really talks about Domhnall Gleeson when talking about that movie, which is interesting because I thought he did the most to sell the trailer. But then he's in The Revenant, playing a typical incompetent boss. Brooklyn, he had a kind of a thankless role there as well. He's in Star Wars, of course, but I thought his performance, some people liked it, but this was a performance that I thought was very cartoonish. I did not like his work at all. Whereas, like, for instance, I liked Adam Driver's work, even though, I liked what Adam Driver tried to do with the role, even though I wasn't such a fan of how it was written. But then he's also on an upcoming Tom Cruise movie directed by Doug Liman, who directed Edge of Tomorrow and the upcoming Gambit movie, and that's called Mina, about a drug runner who was a small secondary character in the Narcos show on Netflix, the Narcos series on Netflix. So I think Domhnall Gleeson, I wish he was getting, I guess in short, I wish he was just getting more lead roles. Well, here's one for him, or at least he's going to be one of the leads, and that is in a movie called A Futile and Stupid Gesture, which is about the founding of National Lampoon and what tragically happened to one of those founders. So it's going to co-star Will Forte, who's had a real career resurgence. He was very lucky that Alexander Payne cast him in Nebraska post Saturday Night Live, and he's really also been able to work and do a lot with that. The Phil Lord and Chris Miller have him in the Last Man on Earth sitcom, and he's in Keanu. I mean, he must be someone people really like because he gets a lot of work, like small little roles, which really, it's kind of like how Bill Paxton used to get a lot of work. People just like the guy. So very happy for Will Forte. He's going to join Domhnall Gleeson in this movie. It's going to be made for about $15 to $20 million, and David Wayne will direct from Wet Hot American Summer, which certainly has its own fans, and of course came to Netflix with a new season and was one of their big gets early on when they were doing original content. Now, so far, Netflix has had Adam Sandler signed on. He has had that one movie, Ridiculous Six. He has another movie coming up with David Spade. Then they had the Pee Wee Herman movie, which I thought was their best movie yet. They also just recently acquired Brad Pitt's political army movie, and then also Bright, which they paid $90 million for, which is going to be the new David Ayer Will Smith movie with a script from Max Landis, which will have some visual effects in it. So they're certainly building a good arsenal of movies here, and they are getting a little bit more mainstream, a little more commercial. But I think that while I applaud their efforts to create something that people would want to see in theaters, right? Their attention-grabbing properties, I do feel that what they're really missing is highbrow fare. Now, Beasts of No Nation had that to some degree, but that film had some really negative aspects to it that while I think were faithful to what actually happens in those circumstances, I think were such a turnoff to a lot of people that Netflix didn't do the movie any favors by not trying to get out in front of that. But since Beasts of No Nation, and Beasts of No Nation really wasn't applauded commercially, either to a huge extent. They really need a breakout, just like House of Cards and Orange is the New Black were lauded by critics. They need something that becomes a critic favorite. The people are like, if you don't watch this, you're missing out. You're going to miss a great piece of filmmaking. And they haven't had that yet. So while, again, I think it's good that they're getting such big names to come over to the streaming service, I think they need to work a little bit harder for who they're getting behind the camera. For instance, Amazon just got Doug Liman to do The Wall movie before he does Gambit. And I think that that's a very clever idea. And, perhaps David Ayer will be the real trick with Bright. But I still think that they need to work a little bit harder in the talent that they're finding behind the camera so they have things that are a little bit more viable critically. All right, so those are the three stories of the day. I'm very curious to what you think of how Netflix is doing in the movie business and if this latest one sounds like a good idea to you. Now for the viewer question, which I think is probably going to generate the most comments for this episode. And that's from Dan Mooney, who commented on Movie Math yesterday when I said that based on the performance of the film, as much as it pains me to say it because I think they did a good job, I think that Zack Snyder and Chris Terrio really do need to go. So Dan said, in your box office update on Monday, you said that Zack Snyder and Chris Terrio need to go from the DC Extended Universe. Who would you suggest to replace them? I thought that was a great question, and I think something that probably Warner Brothers might be discussing right now. Because even if you like the film, I think it's just undeniable at this point that they are a lead weight around the franchise. So a lot of people are suggesting George Miller, but I actually would not go with George Miller. I know he's a producer on Justice League, but I think that we have to remember that Mad Max Fury Road struggled. It did okay. They're not making a sequel. They still haven't greenlit one. I don't think they ever will. Maybe they will, but it's not something that Warner Brothers or George Miller even is particularly excited about. So I think that George Miller, while I loved Mad Max Fury Road, I too would struggle with greenlighting a sequel. And I don't know if George Miller is the type of director that you need to dig them out of this mess, right? Why go with another really intellectual, artistic approach? It doesn't make any sense. I'm seeing a lot of people upset about the lack of mainstream qualities for the film, upset about Batman killing, upset that Superman is not a beacon of hope. So you really need to go back to the core of these characters. You need someone who is very mainstream and isn't going to be experimental with the property, because clearly that's not what people want. So that's now you know where I'm coming from in terms of what I'm looking for. I'm also looking for someone who's available, because all the other studios have really, snatched up all the big directors. Disney, for instance, has so many movies that they're making that they really have an embarrassment of riches, not only in terms of properties but talent. And then also there's people like Christopher McQuarrie, who did such a great job with Mission Impossible: Rogue Nation, but he's already been locked down for the 6th installment of that franchise. So there's not a lot of people who are currently available. And also, you'd like to have someone who has a relationship with Warner Brothers, although that's how Zack Snyder got the gig and this whole mess started. So anyway, one person I was thinking of is Peter Jackson. Everybody loves his big filmmaking. He's very epic, and I think he's very good at giving people what they want and being faithful to source material. And he's not doing anything right now. So I'd be like, you want to jump back into the thick of it, huh? So he's one person I would consider. I would also consider Ron Howard. I think Ron Howard, he's been a little more artistic lately with Rush and In the Heart of the Sea, but he also has the ability to be very commercial. Now, his Angels and Demons movies, with Tom Hanks have been not so great, so that would give me a little bit of pause. But I think, let's not forget that The Grinch Stole Christmas is still the most successful Christmas movie of all time. But again, a lot of people, maybe at least at the time, were not very kind to that film. So he might be a little bit of a question mark as well. Then I thought maybe Alex Garland would be a good choice. I don't know if he'd be interested in taking this on, and he can be experimental too, as we've seen with Ex Machina. But a lot of people really liked Ex Machina, particularly the people who dislike Batman v Superman. So he could win that group over. Also, Dredd was spectacular, and he scripted Dredd. So I'd be interested in seeing him take over. Then I also thought, what about Tim Miller, who directed that absolutely fantastic, DC Extended Universe trailer for the video games a couple of years ago, and he of course then went on to do Deadpool. So, and Warner Brothers even considered using him, but then decided against it. So maybe they could go back to him with a big paycheck and lure him away. Although of course I think he's probably wondering if he's going to do Deadpool 2 at this moment. So we'll see what happens there. But then on that note, I would maybe go for other video game directors and see if I could get them. Then I was thinking, who would write it? Because, I said also Chris Terrio needs to go, which is unfortunate, but I think Chris Terrio is a little bit like Julie Taymor in Spider-Man. I think that her second act in that play was just horrible, but I think she did a lot of interesting things in the first act. And you really have a situation where people who aren't really familiar with the properties and the fandom come in there and reinterpret it based on what interests them. And while I find that very interesting, that clearly doesn't work. We've had 2 colossal disasters at this point, and so you really need to get someone who understands the fan base in there. So, because I think, again, experimentation is not being tolerated. So the person I thought of who would be excellent, and I think maybe even to direct as well, potentially, would be Drew Goddard. I think he did such a good job writing the script for The Martian, and it was such a bright, happy movie, despite dealing with some difficult subject matter, and I think he'd do a really good job. Certainly scripting, maybe even directing. Because I was thinking The Martian would be great. I was like, what about Ridley Scott? And then I was like, Ridley Scott's busy with his own Alien franchise. Again, he has his own toys that he wants to play with. But Drew Goddard, as you might recall, had to leave Daredevil. He got kicked out by Isaac Perlmutter because he signed on for Sinister Six. But now, of course, that's really in development hell because they're trying to reboot Spider-Man with the help of Marvel. So he's kind of stuck right now, and I think he seems somewhat available. And, I know he's kind of in the Marvel camp right now, but they haven't been too good to him. I would consider seeing if I could pull him over to DC with a big enough paycheck and enough power. I'd be like, forget the Snyderverse. How about the Goddardverse? So I would consider him as well. So I'm curious, what do you think of these ideas? Who are you thinking of? And if you're thinking of somebody, don't just write their name down, but write down why you think that they would be a good replacement and how they would combat the current problems that Batman v Superman is facing. I think, we can't just do a wish list. I think we have to be smart about this, just as Warner Brothers needs to be. They have a lot of damage control on their plate, and we'll see. We'll see if they can accomplish it. All right, thank you so much for tuning in. That's today's morning movie news. Write down below what you think of today's top 3 stories and that viewer question, anything you'd like to see covered tomorrow, and any questions that you might have. Thanks for watching. Bye.